So in part 2 of this lecture, we'll be thinking about tracing the poems chronologically, and then we'll be talking about some motifs that are in Skrzynecki's poetry, and I think you should take note of as you read through them again. So why is it worth tracing the poems chronologically? Well, I think you'll find a trend in the foci of his early poems and his later poems. In his earlier poems, the immigrant experience and a lack of understanding between him and his parents is pretty evident. And a lack of appreciation for them is clear as well, especially when he was younger or a child, somewhere in his adolescent years. For example, in 10 Mary Street, we see him come home from school and ravage his parents' garden like a hungry bird. And he uses that verb and that simile for a really important reason, to kind of show his lack of care and understanding of how much his parents put into the garden that they love and take care of like an adopted child, and what that garden really means to them, which we see much more clearly in Felix Skrzynecki. So later poems, for example in his Blood Plums collection, seem to focus on a lot of looking back on the past, particularly his relationship with his parents. It's kind of like when you get to a certain age and you reminisce or consider some memories that you've had or experiences that you've had, you begin to see them in a different light. You begin to view them hopefully through more mature eyes. And his relationship with his parents and his heritage, his Polish heritage, is something that Skrzynecki does think about a lot in his later days. He often uses photos or artifacts. Again, we talked about how his poetry is very personal and intimate. He often uses photos or artifacts, and his poems are a bit of a meditation on what he thinks about and what he imagines as he uses these. So, for example, in Mother and Son and Family Portrait, we see him looking back on photographs, or in the case of Family Portrait, a bit of a, not really a portrait, but 3 separate pictures that have been put together. He goes and visits sites, so like in Migrant Center site, he attributes meaning to the landscape and what the remnants of that place are to him, and how those transport him back into the past. Now, I think in his later poems we do get a sense that he feels some sort of regret, or is it really nostalgia? Or is it a longing to finally connect with his past and origins? I'll leave that one up to you, but we do get a sense that Skrzynecki is both melancholy, but also honouring of the past. There is some fondness there, but there is definitely a sense that he missed something, or he's longing to reconnect with something. Now, this sense of ambivalence that he feels is mostly connected to his family and heritage. And maybe in his later poems he's still thinking about what did, or what does, he now belong to, and how that shapes the way that he thinks about himself. What I think tracing the poems chronologically shows us is that memories, artifacts, etc. help to keep a connection to the past and force us to consider how the past affects how we understand ourselves in the present. And to add to that, I think it also shows how we really only get a sense of appreciation for the experiences of immigrants when we look back, when we revisit, rather than in the present moment in which Skrzynecki himself was in. So, we're going to start looking at some common motifs in his poetry. For those of you who don't know, motifs are reoccurring things, aspects, elements that are present in a lot of Skrzynecki's poetry, and which carry meaning, which carry a certain pattern, and that pattern can help us to understand what he does as a poet, but also the meaning that he tries to create. So, natural imagery. Skrzynecki uses a lot of natural imagery in his poems, and sometimes it's used as literal, to show the beauty and variety of the Australian landscape. But sometimes the natural imagery itself are metaphors. They represent certain ideas or people or things. For example, in Migrant Hostel, he uses 2 similes like a homing pigeon circling to get its bearings, and like birds of passage, always sensing a change in the weather. A point of comparison to compare immigrants to one, highly trained birds, but also birds that are intuitively moving with the seasons. In 10 Mary Street, he describes the garden that his parents took care of, like an adopted, should say, child. That shows the level of care that his parents put into the garden. And that natural imagery there represents obviously more than just a garden to them. And of course we've got, in Migrant Centre site, the agaves, pines and oleanders among native eucalypts. Now what's important about that is that poem is about how the Australian landscape has changed over time as a result of foreigners, migrants, immigrants, moving to Australia and establishing their lives there. And what we see in that natural imagery is foreign plants, foreign flora, agaves, pines and oleanders among local, indigenous ones. And there, I think, metaphors for the people who are local and the people who came over from different countries. Now, this isn't necessarily something that I can prove, but I think this is an interesting idea. Perhaps this natural imagery is linked to the idea that people don't just inhabit or occupy land. So it moves away from a colonial reading, a colonial idea of moving to a new country. Instead, people become a part of it, and a connection is formed between people and the land, which I consider really interesting because it's an ideal central to an indigenous Australian thinking. Whereas in the Western world, we often think about land as something that we possess or something that we obtain. Whereas, for the most part, I think in Skrzynecki's poetry, there's not so much a sense of coming to a new land and taking it, but being shaped by that new land. How that new land shapes your world. How your world clashes or melds with the world that you come to. So I thought that was interesting. Not necessarily something I can prove, but an idea of belonging to a land, I believe, is central to Skrzynecki's poetry. So, other motifs. Physical or man-made structures. Of course, there are literal physical or man-made structures, but they're also metaphorical, also embodying ideas or having life. So if you think about the different places that you go to, or things, the structures that you see, you attribute meaning to them. You describe them in a certain way. You get a certain feeling when you're close to them. They represent things to you. Like school represents something to you. Actual school building. A gate can signify something to you. A playground or a swing can signify something to you. The same thing with Skrzynecki's poetry. Now, the way to understand them is to think about the purpose of such structures. So, for example, bridges. What are they for? They're for connection. They're for enabling a passage between places. And I think in this case, we need to think of them as enabling a passage between worlds. And that's really clear in poems like Immigration Bridge and 10 Mary Street, where you've got a bridge that's burning down. So what could that mean? It could mean that there's a connection that's being destroyed. There could be a passage that is treacherous or dangerous. Depends on how you read the poem. Gates and signals at a train station. So these would be barriers or hurdles preventing movement. And a really obvious example is in Migrant Hostel, where the gate points in reprimand or shame. Now we know that it's not literally doing that, but it's Skrzynecki projecting an idea of what it's like to feel, what it's like to live behind a gate, what it's like to live needing the sanction of a barrier in order to move in and out of that camp, whereas they were probably free people before that. Okay. The next one are types of buildings. So, for example, train stations. Now, I didn't really think about this before, but a train station is a place of transition. People don't stay at train stations. People don't live at train stations. And even if they have to for a certain period of time, there's not really a sense that that place is a place of permanent residence. So for the people and immigrants at Central Station 1951, we know that they are going through a transition because they are in limbo, essentially. They are neither here nor there. And so that train station is an ideal setting to discuss what it's like to transit between points. Think of Skrzynecki's school, St. Patrick's College. It's commonly a place of uniformity and conformity. You think about the uniform, you think about the way that he describes his first day at school, and how his mother went to pains to make sure that he fit in. He conformed to the norms and the appearance there, but his name was the thing that made him stand out. So consider what these places, not just structures, but what these places can mean. Now, obviously, these are connected to certain emotions and memories as well. And I gave that example just before. Just remember that these structures don't seek to have meaning, but that we attribute meaning to them, and Skrzynecki is attributing meaning to these structures. Therefore, if he is attributing meaning to them, then we have to assume that this is something that not just he feels, but when we consider that he writes kind of generally in some poems, that was probably how immigrants were feeling as well. Alright, the last one we're going to talk for now is a really important one. Paradoxes or conflicting ideas. If you're not familiar with what a paradox is, it's when two opposing or seemingly contradicting ideas exist at the same time. For example, belonging and displacement, optimism for the future but also sadness about leaving the past, a sense of pride but also regret. And so we have here conflicting feelings or ideas, and they're often at the end of Skrzynecki's poetry. They're often at the end of the poems, so that we don't get a sense of closure or resolution at the end of the poems. And I think that is very purposeful. I think it mirrors the lack of resolution or closure that immigrants have in their experiences. So these are paradoxes, and it's important for us to hold these paradoxes and embrace them, not to try and solve them, because these paradoxes are actually revealing to us something about the experiences of the persona and of the characters in the poems. Now, I just mentioned this, but they usually leave us feeling conflicted, and I think that that sense of conflict that we feel is but a small mirror into what the immigrants or the characters or the persona in the poems must be feeling themselves, perhaps. Some examples here. Immigrants at Central Station 1951. We get a sense throughout that entire poem that they're sad to leave wherever they came from. It's very melancholy. It's quite a solemn poem. But at the end, there's this little phrase, glistening train tracks, which perhaps suggests optimism for the future. And so you can be at once sad about leaving, but you can also be optimistic about the future, what I think is Skrzynecki showing there. 10 Mary Street. At the end of the poem, in the last stanza, the family becomes naturalized, that is, they become citizens of Australia, but they receive a key, a metaphorical one, that will open no house when 10 Mary Street is pulled down. And so there's a sense that even though they've been accepted and become a part of Australia, officially, legally, they are having to leave behind 10 Mary Street, and they're never going to get it back. And a poem that you might be not as familiar with, Seeing My Parents. The last stanza is quite a sad one, but also beautiful. It's written during a time where it's written at a point where Skrzynecki's parents are no longer alive, and it's him looking back at them and wanting to thank them for everything. But now they're just memories, and so that he's not able to actually do that. There's some beautiful imagery at the end where they're crossing the road, and he's reaching out to them, but they're just that one step ahead of them, and he's never really going to get there. So there's a sense of wanting to thank them for everything, a sense of gratitude, but also a conflicting feeling that he's never going to be able to do that because they're now just memories.